How do you create safe learning environments for diversity to thrive? When we think about whiteness, a lot of time we think that we're talking about skin color and white people. And in essence, we're actually not.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is this notion of dominant discourses.
Welcome to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. This podcast is recorded on the Gadigal and Wongal lands, the Eora Nation. I want to pay my deepest respects to our elders past and present, recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It was never ceded by treaty. And just come off the back of this recent episode with Professor Jioji Ravulo from the School of Social Work and Policy at the University of Sydney. And met Jioji a while back and have been following his work for a long time. He's a regular contributor in mainstream media. He's a regular panel member across the Drum on the ABC, and very much emerging as very much established as a thought leader in the space of policy, social work, and a range of other areas as well. For me, I got so much out of this episode in terms of how we look at systems thinking, policy, ways of working. We take a real deep dive into decolonisation, critical whiteness theory, and it's a real significant episode for, I think, anyone that likes to think broadly, systemically, and in terms of the big picture, in terms of how we navigate some of these significant problems that we're facing in the justice system, in the community development sector, and all that sort of stuff as well. I really hope you enjoy the episode. It's my favourite one to date, and thanks for tuning in and watching. All right, everybody, welcome to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. Really stoked to be joined here today by Jioji Ravulo, Professor of Social Work and Policy from the University of Sydney. We've been connected for some time now. Massive fan of his work and the content that he's putting out there and the space that he's taking up, and really pleased to be able to get the opportunity to share some space together today. So yeah, welcome to the episode. Maybe we can kick off by you just maybe telling us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing these days and all that sort of stuff.
Sure. So Nissan Bulavanaka and G'day. Very excited to be here with you, Sam. And yes, it's been great to be involved in the role that I have at the University of Sydney. And also to continue the journey of understanding what it means to be me as part of my role, both as an academic, as a researcher, as a writer, as someone that talks into various spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And we first connected last year through some personal connections that we have outside of the professional world. And I think you'd maybe sort of new into that space there, or you'd been at Sydney Uni for maybe 12 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we sort of had one of the first sort of interesting conversations we had was around policy, because obviously we're from impact policy, and we often get questions all the time about what that means and what that represents and all that sort of stuff. And I know we had a really interesting conversation around policy and its role in social work. And I just wanted to maybe kick off that yarn starting there. In terms of what that sort of means for yourself, your journey, where you've been at now in terms of the role that sort of shapes for yourself at Sydney Uni and the work that you're doing as well today. Because I think it's one of those sorts of areas where it can be an unknown.
Totally. It's interesting because that P word, that policy, right? I remember when I first was studying my undergraduate in social work, I remember coming across that P word and being somewhat unsure about what it all meant, but also quite scared about what it actually might mean, because it requires a lot of head work, right, in regards to understanding what that P or the policy word means.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, what policy is all about, it's about being able to create opportunities for our society, especially social policy, to be inclusive. And when I think about good policy, I think about inclusive societies, the way in which we create safe spaces for everyone. And being at the University of Sydney, where I'm on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to past, present, and emerging.
Absolutely.
And also, the lands are considered stolen because sovereignty was never ceded. That has always been a starting place for a lot of my shared conversations as I continue to work across different spaces. How do we ensure that Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming are also privileged, a part of that shared conversation? Coming from a Pacific Indigenous heritage myself, I strive to do the ally work in Australia to ensure that such diverse perspectives can be included, but it does take a shared effort.
Absolutely. And I think it's what you touched on there in terms of what that sort of P word and policy space represents for our communities, I think is the trigger point for the uncertainty or the recognition of the significance of its place within the social and community space, because for so long, our communities and families' experiences of policy have not been positive. They haven't been empowering. They've been
100%. 100%. And that's exactly the point of good policy, is that if our families, if our individuals within the families are being left behind and are not doing well in education or being left behind when it comes to their engagement with health services or how they interact with the law or access welfare benefits, like all of that is a reflection of policy. So I think it's really, really important that we don't take for granted what that P word and what policy means and its impact on our communities.
Absolutely. When a lot of people ask us at Impact Policy, you're like, oh, so you write policy? I'm like, well, not really. We could probably be involved in that part of the journey. But a big part of when we talk about, I guess, what impact policy means for us is it like what informs the development of good policy.
Nice.
It's, for us, it's about, when a policy is written, it's based on engagement, connection, relationships, research, evaluation. All these pieces of the puzzle go into forming the decisions that made when policies ultimately formed and guides a direction.
Yeah.
And so for us, it's like that is the impact for good policy.
I agree. And I think what generally might be missing when it comes to, again, the creation of good policy and the ability for it to have helpful impact is exactly what you said. What is the process behind the development of that particular policy itself? Were our communities genuinely collaborated alongside or consulted alongside to ensure that that policy is a good fit? So that's half the challenge. That's
Absolutely.
half the struggle, is
Absolutely.
to try and understand the processes behind the development and even implementation of policy.
Can you have there been experiences, or even just through your role at the university, where you've come across case studies or best practice examples where you've seen the policy space working well, or where areas for improvement?
Yeah, I think a good practice approach to good policy is one where you're able to capture different voices as part of the development. So you're aware of the actors, the people that are involved. And a lot of time when we think about policy actors, we're talking about, government stakeholders and corporates and media. But we also need to ensure that we're thinking about community. Coming from a social work background, again, my passion is inclusion. My passion is, what does it mean for individuals within families, within their communities, to be included? So if we are then creating housing policy, or if we're creating education policy, are we ensuring that those lived experiences that come from being in those communities is actually understood? And that's what's key to a good practice approach to good policy.
Absolutely. And so much of being successful in amplifying those voices comes down to really understanding how to do work differently, or maybe decolonizing your thinking around what good practice can represent and look like.
Totally.
And all that sort of stuff. And I think that sort of, for a long time, we've been around for a year and a half at Impact Policy. We're still growing. But we're an Aboriginal owned and led organisation, and we're really conscious that the value that we can add goes across the sector, not just in Aboriginal affairs, youth, mental health, housing, everything you've touched on, whatever. And so for a big part of me, I really wanted to try and position the work that we do is in terms of social policy broadly. The result is 99% of our work is specific to Aboriginal communities, and that's fantastic. But a big part of me always thought, how do I embed these perspectives and ways of working across the sector? Because this is only going to do stuff like you touched on in terms of amplifying stories of lived experience and engagement of diverse communities and all that sort of stuff. And I think listening to some of your work recently as well has helped me understand that journey a little bit more better, because I don't think it's more us amplifying or inserting, Aboriginal ways of thinking, knowing and being into the broader system and sector. But I think it's more about actually what value can we add in terms of maybe decolonising or deconstructing how some of those other sectors are doing their work. And so I sort of wanted to maybe lean into a bit of a different yarn around some of that sort of space, because I listened to your TEDx Sydney talk that was only recent. I think end of last year, was it?
Yes, middle of last year.
Yeah, it was great. Loved it.
Oh,
really
thank you.
Got a lot out of it. Especially the singing.
Check it out for the singing alone.
That's it. But yeah, I wanted to maybe just touch on some of your thinking around the decolonising sort of space and all that sort of that yarn there around the beyond the binary talk and different things like that. I'd love to hear some more.
In Western, generally white societies, we are quite obsessed with this notion of the binary, that there's one way or the other way. There's only two ways of looking at things. But in a lot of our Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming, both locally here in Australia, from what I've learned, but also from the Pacific Indigenous view, but also other global Indigenous communities, society, the way in which we view and see and practice is more fluid and flexible, and that's sort of across an array of different things. So things are not so static and fixed. So it's not just about being right or wrong, black or white, good or bad. A lot of the way in which we relate as Indigenous cultures is relationally driven. It's not driven by time or money, which then creates this binary of this or that. You're rich or poor. And so that talk really was trying to encourage people to live beyond the binary way of thinking, feeling and behaving. Again, check it out. But it is about encouraging us to move beyond just this static and fixed way of looking at life.
Yeah, definitely. You talked a lot about the concept of intersectionality and intersectional identities.
Yes.
And it's something that I'm really interested in, because even like I spent a bit of time in the DE&I space when I was in the public sector, and I'd often find that we'd be looking at programs and pathways and different things just from one lens. This is just a women in senior leadership program, or this is just an Aboriginal employment program, or a people living with a disability program, and there'd be all these conversations around equity and access, and I'd often think about intersectionality.
Yes.
And then sometimes I'd often find different perspectives around what that meant. So I'd love to have a yarn about intersectional identities, intersectionality, and hear your thoughts.
Awesome. Intersectionality was developed by some really amazing Black academics and activists from the United States, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, and other key people that have spoken into those particular areas, like Bell Hooks. And what it really represents is this idea that we're more than just one particular identity classification. So for example, we are a gender expression, and you're right, a lot of the time we might think about how do we create equity around gender, but we're more than just gender. We're also class, so socioeconomic status. We've got a background or history based on our class. We also have an intersecting identity when it comes to our language, our education, our sexuality. And when I talk about sexuality, I'm not talking about being part of the LGBTIQA plus community. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about everyone has some form of sexual expression.
Totally.
So we all come from that and shape our worldview around that. We all have a form of ability. I'd rather use the word ability rather than disability. So everyone has some form of ability that they bring as part of their identity. So again, when we think about cultural diversity, it's more than just ethnics or nationality. It's all about those other things like gender, class, religion, sexuality, language, indigeneity. Totally. So it's really, really important that we understand that we have what's known as intersecting identifiers or multiple identities. And good policy, but good societies, inclusive societies, are intersectional and strive to understand all those various things rather than just one over the other.
Yeah, definitely. And is there am I right with trying to understand as well that if you connect with or identify with multiple groups, that the disadvantage can be compounding?
Yes, that's right. So if people might have different intersecting identifiers, there are people that may come from multiple ones and then also experience multiple areas of discrimination or being marginalized as a result of those particular things. So for myself personally, I grew up in public housing in Western Sydney. I identify as a person of colour from an Indigenous Pacific background. I am part of the queer community, so traditionally identify as bisexual and queer. Yep. So there's different identities that I intersect across, but then might also lead to my discrimination in different areas.
Definitely.
So it is a matter of then understanding how some people may actually experience more areas of discrimination or marginalization as a result. Women who are also people of colour from Indigenous backgrounds, we find also experience harsher realities as a result of those intersecting identifiers.
Definitely.
So that's why intersectionality was created, and it needs to continue to be further unpacked, especially here in Australia. I think we still have a long way to go when it comes to understanding intersectionality.
Yeah, absolutely. What's, I guess, in your journey, you're the only Pacifica I was going to say president. Professor. Is that correct in Australia right now?
No, there's a couple of others that have come through now, which is fantastic.
Unreal.
So when I became a professor at the University of Sydney in March of 2021, I had no idea at the time, but I was the first person of a Pacific Indigenous heritage to become a professor in Australia. Yeah. And that was a surprise. It was both a celebration for myself and my family and the broader community.
Absolutely.
But it was also a reminder that why did it take until 2021 for someone from a Pacifica heritage to become a professor in Australia? So that is also a challenge for all of us to actually think further about what is it about our education systems that deter such achievement to occur. We've got some other amazing professors now in the space. Professor Katerina Teowa from the Australian National University.
Shout out
to her. The work that she continues to do continues to lead and provide visibility for Pacifica voices to be recognised and to be understood across the Oceania region, and how we're understood even as a diaspora here in Australia. And there's other people coming through as well, which is fantastic. We've got Latia Mioswamba, who's just become an associate professor at Western Sydney University. She's in social work and policy as well. And so she's also been actively involved in developing, that notion of what does it mean to understand Pacific perspectives across different areas. But you're right. If we don't have those particular people around, then how can we then create safe spaces for other people of diversity, of Indigenous Pacific perspectives and heritages to come through?
Absolutely. Has it been has it been somewhat of a journey coming into one of the, if not the oldest, tertiary institution in Australia, at the time being the first Pacifica leader there to navigate a space like that and to take up that space?
Well, not going to lie. Real talk. Universities are traditionally very white and Western spaces.
Very much so.
They are. And I've done quite a bit of research on how do we encourage equity groups that traditionally don't go to further education and training, including universities, to see themselves in those spaces. And a lot of the time, Pacific people may not see themselves in these sort of white Western spaces because they feel like they're not for them.
Totally.
Some of the terminology that I've heard over the years from Pacific young people about the idea of potentially going to university is, well, that's just Fia Balangi. If you want to go to university, it's just you want to be like a white person.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work over the many years has been to reshift that particular perspective and even narrative that we as Pacific people can go into further education and training like at universities, because again, traditionally they are very white and Western. Part of the challenge then also, Sam, is to ensure that we are decolonizing universities, that we are deconstructing, but also I use another D word, disrupting those spaces in a way that does create space for diversity to come through.
What does that sort of look like when you talk to some of that? Is there an example?
Yeah, examples include, and it's really exciting. I'm seeing a lot more Aboriginal students come through, especially in social work at the University of Sydney. And one of the key things is to ensure that Aboriginal students feel like they have a safe space that they can go to within our universities, that they've also got other people present in areas of our degree that actually makes them feel understood.
Totally.
Like if you go into spaces and you feel like, again, you're not welcomed because you're not understood, then it's very hard for you to continue on in those spaces. But a big shout out, recently we celebrated International World Social Work Day, or World Social Work Day, which is internationally, of course, recognised and celebrated. And we had our Aboriginal students in social work put on a special event last week to celebrate that. And it was amazing to see the leadership of our Black students, it's called Black Social Work, come through, but also their desire to continue to support first year students in our undergraduate program and our postgrad programs to feel welcomed and feel valued and to feel supported. And if we're not, as universities, creating safe spaces for that to occur, then that won't occur. So it's very, very important that we allow that to come through.
Yeah, awesome. Because as you're talking, I was thinking about some really staunch Black social workers that I know in the space that are really doing some great work. Shout out to Carly Stewart and some others down in Waterloo and South Sydney doing great stuff. But it made me think about, I've seen them talk about stuff like we're talking about decolonizing and all that sort of stuff, like even talking about like social work as a framework for how that's been operating for a long time, is, thinking about that from a decolonizing perspective in terms of decolonizing social work theory and how that positions our people as problems or as,
Completely agree. It's interesting. So the idea of social work generally as a profession, it has come from a Western white lens, and it has developed over the many years in such Western and white spaces. I've been involved in developing the concept of Pacific social work.
Yeah, okay.
And for us, it's about being able to privilege Pacific Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming in the context of social work, service delivery, models, provision, policy, research. So it's first starting with Pacific Indigenous perspectives in mind to then build upon. It's interesting because I think you alluded to this point as well in the question, is that for many, 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 many centuries, our Indigenous communities, whether they be in the Pacific or in Australia or globally, have been practicing forms of social work.
Absolutely.
And so we've, in the West, decided to professionalize this idea of social work.
Totally.
So we need to recognize, again, from the beginning, that in a lot of our Indigenous cultures, social work or the practice of caring for others is already embedded in our ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming.
Absolutely. I love that. And one thing I wanted to come back to as well was when talking about some of that examples of where you've seen, we talk about access and equity and spaces and inclusion. When I first came across your work, I was in my undergrad, and I think you'd maybe recently finished your PhD at that point in time, or it was, we're going back a bit now.
Yeah, back in the days.
Anyway, but when I first come across your stuff, I think you'd only been early into or somewhat into the Pacifica Achievement through Higher Education program.
Yes, path.
So when you talked about some of the examples at Sydney Uni of some of those social work students and black fellas there doing amazing stuff, it made me think about, the years of following that I'd been doing, watching the work that you were doing in that space, and thinking about the impact that you've had for so many Pacifica young people, particularly across Western Sydney and the communities you're connected to, in terms of really decolonising, deconstructing and disrupting, the space there. So anything you want to share there?
Yeah. So Pacifica Achievement to Higher Education Path as a program celebrated its 10th year last year.
Yeah, wow.
It was created when I first started as an academic in 2012. I first started my first full-time gig as a lecturer at Western Sydney University, where I did all of my degrees. So I'm literally a product of Western Sydney University, where I did my social work degree, my master's in education, and my doctorate in cultural research. Then picked up my first full-time gig as an academic in the middle of 2011, and I was challenged by the first 6 months of my role, where I didn't see many Pacific people come into the space and, in essence, be retained in that space. So Pacifica Achievement to Higher Education was established at the beginning of 2012. And the idea behind the model was to create a safe space for Pacific students to come and feel like they were included and involved in their own learning environments. So I come from an education background, as I just noted, and I'm very much around this idea of critical pedagogies, this idea of how do you create safe learning environments for diversity to thrive. And you've got some real key philosophers like Freire, who is a Brazilian philosopher, educational philosopher, and he was all about this idea of how do you create, again, pedagogies, or what we call pedagogies, which is this notion of the science of teaching and learning. How do we create those practices to be more inclusive? And one of his theories is that if you provide scope for people from diverse backgrounds to feel valued for their diversity in their learning environments, it helps them to first feel like they belong. But as a result of them feeling like they belong, they then can contribute to their learning environment, which then in turn enables them to feel safe and secure and retained, to enable them to then course complete. I use those particular philosophies and theories to then create the model of Pacifica Achievement to Higher Education to enable diversity to be privileged, so that Pacific people felt valued and could feel to feel part of that particular learning approach and experience.
And one of the things that stands out for me about that is the ownership, leadership, delivery and implementation of that program by people from those communities. Would that be one of the key factors?
The key factor is enabling our communities to have a space to feel like they're valued for being Pacific.
Totally.
If we don't do that, then we create, again, that binary approach of us and them.
Yeah.
We also create this approach around this notion of assimilation, which I think a lot of our policies in the Australian landscape has based itself on. This idea that people from any diversity, even people from Aboriginal heritages and backgrounds, have to fit in or F off, right? Like this is the policy landscape in Australia.
Absolutely.
So I'm not sure if we're allowed to swear, but I will keep it professional. But that's what really makes me angry, is this idea that we have to fit in. And that, again, is contrary to what diversity is all about. Diversity should be seen as a source of celebration and should be embraced, because it's through our ability to embrace diversity that we can then create inclusive societies.
Absolutely. I spent a bit of time in the university space in the diversity and inclusion area in a few different similar sorts of programs to probably what Path was trying to achieve. And I remember going to a conference in Perth once, and it was all about diversity and inclusion in the tertiary sector. And it's funny coming off the back of the yarns that we've been having around intersectionality and stuff like that. But my experiences within those spaces is that whilst there was many practitioners and people in the room that were maybe from diverse backgrounds, intersectional backgrounds, it was still a very white space. And I think particularly for Aboriginal communities, I imagine it might be the same for Pacifica communities and other marginalised groups, that often it's the presence of whiteness that can be, that can be one of the factors in terms of impacting engagement and ultimately retention of communities as well.
I agree. A lot of my current work is on the notion of critical whiteness. So I'm involved in helping put together a new handbook that's being published by Springer called the Handbook of Critical Whiteness, Deconstructing Dominant Discourses Across Disciplines. I'm obsessed with alliteration, right? And this handbook will have over 100 chapters from different authors globally on different disciplines. And the idea behind this handbook is about calling out this idea of whiteness. Now, what is whiteness? Now, when we think about whiteness, a lot of time we think that we're talking about skin color and white people. And in essence, we're actually not.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is this notion of dominant discourses, this notion that there is one way and one way only. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about whiteness. And as a result of thinking that there's this one way, we then create these particular barriers for other views to come through. And when we think about whiteness, we're thinking about this idea that West is best, white is right. So that's what we're thinking, what we're talking about when we're thinking about whiteness. So a lot of my ongoing work is to call that out, is to call out this idea that there's only one way and that the other way is wrong. Again, that binary, right? We're going back to this binary. That's what whiteness is trying to achieve, is this idea of there's this one way and there's this only way. But again, deconstructing, decolonizing, disrupting that binary in whiteness is what critical whiteness is about.
Yeah, wow, I love it. It's and it's that binary stuff really speaks to a lot of the work that we do in the policy space, in terms of even in what, if we're working specifically with Aboriginal communities, recognizing that there is no one way to do any piece of work, even within specific community groups. There's still a non-binary in terms of how you approach that work. Is it an urban community on Gadigal country here in Sydney? Is it a remote regional community in Mungandai in far west New South Wales? And the thinking and the lens and the approach that you take to each aspect of that project is going to be very different.
Oh, I agree. And this is, again, a symptom of Western white thinking, right? This idea that we're all homogenous. We're all this one. And I agree that we need to create notions of unity and inclusion.
Yep.
But that notion of unity and inclusion is about diversity, really. It's about understanding that we have multiple languages, even in the Fijian context, right? In the Pacific Indigenous Fijian context, there's lots of different villages, there's lots of different languages. And we were able to thrive as societies prior to colonization because of our ability to live and embrace within those diverse ways of knowing and doing, right? Even within those settings. It's the same, I believe, here within the Australian First Nations landscape, is that there's lots of diverse ways of looking at things. And unfortunately, in Western white thinking, it's, again, one way or the other way, and it really should be this one way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, the stuff you talk to around thinking about the impact of colonization in terms of what that's meant for the value of culture and knowledge, and that's something that always sort of really sticks out for me. Like, we share a connection in that my partner's from Fijian background, so both our children are Fijian. We share a connection there, and I'm really big on my son. He's living on in community here in Sydney. He's got a really strong connection to his Aboriginal community, his family, and his Fijian family as well. But growing up in Sydney, Australia, in South Sydney, it's not a very strong presence of his ability to be able to connect and embrace his Fijian culture and heritage. And our first way that we connected was through a community program, and what really attracted me to that program was the absence of the church, you know, because for me, I was looking around at all these opportunities for my son to be able to connect and to learn and to grow. And for the most part, it was often within, you know, the church and community settings. And for me, I really just wanted a way for him to be able to connect and learn and celebrate his culture that was separate from the presence of something that was so symbolic of what had been lost as well. And so I often found that relationship for me personally as a black fella as well didn't sit well with me. So that's why I really loved when we found that space that we connected through. And so just sort of on that, like any thoughts or perspectives around some of those challenges that maybe young people are experiencing today, or just the issue around how to navigate that sort of stuff? Because I often think about, you know, we'll talk about Western Sydney today as well, and different communities too, but so much of the critical ingredient for our young people is culture and identity as a strength. And navigating that connection and finding that is often one of the most protective factors in...
Totally. And I agree with you. I think that in a lot of the work that I've done and I continue to do in even the youth justice space with Pacific and Aboriginal young people here in New South Wales, a lot of the challenges is how do we create scope for our traditional cultures to also be valued and understood. And it's starting to break through, which is great. You've got some really good leadership and management in spaces like Cobham Youth Justice Centre, and shout out to Leilani, who's doing a lot of work out there with her colleagues to ensure that such knowledges are being privileged even in these particular spaces, in you know, traditionally correctional spaces for young people. And they're getting great outcomes, and they're getting great opportunities as a result of acknowledging traditional cultures, whether that be Pacific or First Nations Australians. Even Middle Eastern programs and African programs are coming through as well. And the idea is that if we can again create scope for people's diversity to be valued, it enables them to feel like they can then work towards other outcomes. The other challenge, though, is ensuring, and this is the reality zone, this is what I found and I continue to find from my research in these areas. It is also empowering our diverse communities to also learn how to understand the Western systems in which they're located. So I think it's important to definitely empower our communities to have a connection to culture. So important. Language, storytelling, histories associated with our traditions and how that should be maintained. But being in a Western and white society here in Australia, we also need to empower our communities to learn how to keep up with Western and white structures. At the same time, though, we need to also challenge our Western and white structures to be better in adapting and creating their responses to diversity. So it is multiple different ways of doing things. Let me give you an example so it makes more sense. So I've done a lot of work in the mental health space, and we go, okay, we need to ensure Pacific people are accessing mental health services. But if mental health services aren't nuanced to understanding how we as Pacific people see our mental health and well-being, then we're not going to access those services. So the accountability happens across multiple settings, not just on Pacific people getting better, but also on the health system to get better in responding to our diversity. So again, a lot of the time we go, those people need to be better in accessing services. No. You as a health service need to be better in developing the way in which you understand our diversity and how we understand mental health and well-being, and then come and work with us, as opposed to just putting the responsibility and even blame on us to be better.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that across the board in the mental health space, particularly the youth mental health space, in terms of the ability to access services that are or programs that are singular in how they respond to young people's mental health or issues that they're experiencing. And so I often think about that as, you know, we talk about decolonization again, like changing the way we look at how we work with young people and communities, as opposed to symptomatic, to as a whole and how they come and present themselves, which is how our communities.
Completely agree. In a lot of our mental health settings, we use the Western medical model, which is again pathologizing the individual for their illness. We don't locate the individual in their family and or community. And we know as Indigenous peoples, that's first and foremost where we come from, is our family and community. If we fail to locate the individual within their family and community, we're then going to create mental health treatment plans and recovery plans that is not inclusive of family and community. And that's the problem. That's why we continue to see issues with our mental health and well-being, because the system and our models from the Western white view is not understanding us and the context in which we come from.
Absolutely. I see this massive there's a program that I've seen operating community that's had a lot of success in the youth mental health space, and a big part of what I think from my time with it and seeing it from its success is almost its ability, particularly for black followers, but young people from across the community, is because it's a service that delivers a combination of different programs, mental health, AOD, driving lessons, like everything is there. It's almost, there's anonymity around the support that you're seeking. So the presence of shame is almost dissipated, because it's not like, Headspace does amazing work, nothing wrong with Headspace. But if I walk into Headspace as a young person and somebody sees me, 9 times out of 10, they're going to know that I'm going there for my mental health. And we know that such a big part for all young people, but particularly for black followers and our communities that we're connected to, is even heightened, that sense of shame. And particularly because our communities are so connected, the presence of the stigma and the sight and connection of that as well. So I just thought, coming off the back of what you just said there, really sort of amplifies how the system as a whole can maybe think a bit more differently about how we look at youth mental health and the sector itself.
Completely agree. Again, it's this whole idea of just one particular identity, right? So when we see someone for their mental health, we think that's all we need to treat is their mental health. But you're right. It is. We need to create a holistic approach to our well-being, which we know from Indigenous ways of knowing it, that our health is always holistically driven. That just because we have an issue with our arm or our mind or with our ability to connect socially, that's not an issue with those things alone. It's an issue with the bigger picture of our connection with self and others. And so if we're going to create treatment plans, we need to actually treat the person holistically. A practical example is I still do clinical work outside of my academic role. And it's very easy for people to come to me for that one, to be referred based on one issue. But a lot of the time, especially if it's related to drugs and alcohol and mental health. But when I start to do the counseling sessions with the people that I work with, they're surprised that I start to talk about all these other areas to do with their life and really not focus solely on their mental health or their drugs and alcohol. And the reason being is because those things, like a mental health concern or a problem with drugs, is symptomatic of all these other things that's happening in their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I find there's a real epidemic of trauma. And it's the DSM doesn't diagnose trauma. It
that's right.
often diagnoses the symptoms of trauma.
That's right. Hit the nail on the head. Sam, completely agree. What's happening is that we continue to create these band-aid approaches to health and well-being, as opposed to actually understanding the reason why these health and well-being concerns came up in the first place.
I've read some really interesting books last year in this sort of space and got really interested in it, thinking about my own trauma as a kid and my own healing journey and all that sort of stuff. And when I worked in the youth mental health and AOD space, we had a trauma-informed approach to how we did our work. And it was my first experience in that sector. And I thought that was, for me, coming from that lived experience, I was like, oh, this makes sense. Like, I thought it was the standard operating procedure in terms of the sector. And then as I grew and I moved around, I sort of realized how unique and how best placed a lot of that work was, particularly with young people, in terms of leading from that trauma-informed way of working and strengths-based way of working as well with young people. And I think you're completely right. Like that's the issue that we're seeing across the justice system and across so many communities that are navigating complex needs, is that there's all this trauma that has never been addressed, and all these services that have dealt with those symptoms.
That's it. Completely agree. We think that for us to eradicate youth crime, we need to be tough on young people who are committing crime. It's actually the opposite. It's actually the opposite, people. It's the opposite. If we're not actually creating law and policy that enables us to actually understand the significant trauma that most to all of the young people that I've come across in the youth justice space, they've come from having significant social and welfare needs, which has led to them being seen as criminals. And as a result, if we don't actually deal with those significant social and welfare needs, then we're actually not going to significantly deal with those problematic behaviors that have led to their interactions with the justice space.
Absolutely. We the episode before today with you, we had Dylan Voller on the podcast, the young person from the Royal Commission into Dondale. And he shared his story, where he's at right now. He's very much still on his healing journey, but he's doing some really great stuff. And we reflected on his journey in terms of service support and intervention. And at the moment, he's connected with some really great services and support networks. And he just reflected on the complete absence of that throughout his whole childhood and adolescent journey, in terms of the impact of the abuse that he'd experienced even way before he even got into the justice system, not to mention what the trauma that he'd been through within the system as well. And just really reflected on the impact that having a service that was holistic, that was trauma-informed and led with that from the start, could have had so much of a impact for him as a young person, and I think that's just one story of many. I think if we walked into Cobham or any centre any day of the week, 9.9% of those kids are often experiencing the most complex of needs that we 100%. Could imagine.
Completely agree. They're trauma saturated, like literally. And if we're not actually trauma informed, which is about being able to understand the trauma, the history associated with having trauma, we only continue to traumatize them. So we need to be better. We need to do better as a society.
Absolutely. And it's timely, we've just come off the back of an election. We've got a new state government here as well. So hopefully we can start to see a bit of a shift in that sort of space. We do a little bit of work in the justice space in terms of research and evaluation. I know that there's some amazing professionals within that space that are pushing and driving some systemic change, and hopefully with the right leadership and that sort of stuff, we can really start to see some sort of progress in that area too.
I completely agree. So Chris Minns, call me.
He's the man. Hit him up. Hey, I come across, my background's in criminology. Graduated with honours from UNSW. Shout out UNSW. Good mob there. And that's where I first come across you, like I mentioned. But when I listened to your TEDx talk, I follow you for a long time anyway, which is why I wanted to get you on. But I come across the article that you co-authored about the issue around 1-4 and the criminalisation of 1-4 and drilling and that sort of stuff. And I thought it was refreshing to come across it. And I was like, okay, great. Like people are like, thought leaders are talking about this sort of stuff and bringing a lens to this, because, for the most part, it's just happened and it is what it is. So I would love to hear, particularly from a Black Pacifica man from Western Sydney, who's an academic and brings that whole professional lens to that sort of space, a bit about that work and your thoughts in that sort of area.
So this is ongoing work that's happening, and shout out to Professor Mari Lee and Dr. Toby Martin, and we've also got Alexis from Griffith University that's jumped on board as well. And we've also had Ricky, who's the manager of 1-4, involved in this, and also Harry has done some work with us as well. This work is really about being able to create a better understanding of how people that look like us, who are in these spaces of music, are being over-policed for our expression a lot of time the expression is based on artistry, which is this idea of being able to reflect the narratives associated with the realities, and to use music as an art form to bring those narratives to a broader audience. And 1-4 have been massively successful from Western Sydney, from areas like Doonside and Mount Druitt. And they've been able to provide a light on the realities, on the lived experience associated with growing up in such areas. And yes, there has been violence. Yes, there has been crime associated with those areas. But the police don't like the idea of such lyrics, narratives, lived experience being popularized. And that's where they've then clutched their pearls and created tensions and problems for our artists from Pacific backgrounds. So it has been racially motivated. I believe a lot of the tensions associated with the over-policing and a lot of the research that we're doing is about being able to profile, to call that out, to create scope for such perspectives to be heard and listened to and hopefully understood. Because one of the things we say is that if it was a white person that was actually sharing or actually creating even these particular lyrics, they wouldn't be over-policed like this. So
yeah, absolutely.
There is a racial element to it and something that we need to be more mindful of.
Yeah, I thought it was timely to bring it up. You know, they recently tried to walk out to there was a boxing event not long ago, world title fight, and they were going to walk out with one of the fighters. I think the group was going to walk out, and there was clips across social media of police briefing them and giving the banning notice that couldn't happen.
Yes, and
so it triggered the work that I'd seen that you do in this space. The shout out to Amanaki Studios who are producing this, Pacifica owned and led media production team, 2 brothers from Mount Druitt, Mounty County. So very big Western Sydney element across the whole of this podcast and episode. But when I saw that clip, it reminded me of, I'm not the biggest hip hop fan in the world, but, Straight Outta Compton, when I watched that movie and the police try to stop them singing Fuck the Police.
Yes.
And they're getting briefed in the background. Yes. When I saw that clip on Instagram, it straight away took me to, what NWA had been sort of policed in terms of what their lived experience was like back in those days.
Totally. And that's the point that we really want to continue to highlight is that for Pacific people, music has been part of our mobility, both economically, but socially, but also a reflection of our stories. That's how we've been able to communicate and pass on narratives over the many generations, music. And so to then create an over-policing and a tension with something that has been innately used throughout traditions for many years, it just creates again this real unhelpful presence for us as Pacific people. That police are constantly now already. Well, there's been. I mean, the reason why I went into the youth justice space was because I found a report in the late 90s that highlighted that we as Pacific people receive double the sentence severity than our white counterparts, irrespective of the same offences, the same offending history, right? So the legal system has a history of creating tensions because of our appearance.
Totally. Undisputed.
That's right. And so it continues to happen 20, 30 years on. And for me, that's a problem. And that's what needs to be called out. And we need to hold such practices, such policing to account. We really do. And unfortunately, this is where the police may use certain legislation to justify their particular approaches, to the detriment then of us as Pacific people.
Yeah, totally. Because then what's the broader impact for what that means in terms of Pacific young people across Western Sydney and communities that are finding a sense of connection, a sense of something through storytelling and lived experience of being heard, of whatever that can represent and what that journey can be. the silencing of that is often
Yes.
so much more detrimental.
Completely agree with you. And that's where also a lot of the stereotypes and tropes continue to be reinforced. I know looking like this and turning up in different spaces, I'm still very, very conscious that when I turn up into white Western spaces, that I'm already being judged by virtue of being Pacific and being in such spaces, right? And you know that also being in such spaces does both challenge people to think that we can be in these spaces, but at the same time, we still hold that sense of uncertainty about being in these spaces in the first place.
Definitely.
It's a challenge.
How do you think we navigate the you talked about the 90s, the issue around Pacifica overrepresentation in the prison system, and still today, 2023, and much of those stats are still the same. We see Pacifica communities significantly overrepresented in the justice system. Same with blackfellas, and stuff like that. And not much is shifting with the needle. But the evidence is there, and the research is there, and there's so much great work that's been done into uncovering this sort of stuff. What do you think are some of the key, policy shifts that we might need to see, or systemic thinking that might need to shift in terms of how we understand and impact this sort of stuff?
We need to bring it back to humanity, really. I think we've lost the humanness of our social structures and systems. We see people caught up in the legal system as these entities, these beasts, these people that are untouchable. And we've lost that notion that they're just people that have significant social and welfare needs. We've lost that perspective of understanding their humanity.
Totally.
And we as a society, as a socially driven society, because we all belong to this as humans. We and I know that I'm talking very big here, this notion of humanity, right? But really, we've lost that notion of what we as Indigenous people again know. We as people belong to each other.
Definitely.
We've lost that notion that we are all responsible for each other. There's been some amazing quotes that have been said by lots of different thought leaders over years, and one of them includes this idea of society should be treated, or a good society should reflect how it treats its most vulnerable. And if we as a society continue to treat our most vulnerable in a unhelpful way, then that's a reflection of us.
Totally. And I think we've touched on some of some really significant pieces of the puzzle when we think about this sort of work. We were talking about like the mental health space and the AOD space and the lack of trauma-informed ways of thinking and working in that sort of area. And I think the same rules apply to the justice space too.
Totally.
And we look at the significant overrepresentation of people with a diagnosed mental health condition in prison right now.
That's right.
Same rules apply.
Massive. I agree with you. Like, the research and data continues to say and show that those that are in the adult system, a high proportion have untreated or undiagnosable mental health issues. It's the same with those that are homeless. A large proportion of those that are sleeping rough have the same, an untreated or undiagnosed mental illness. Like, what are we doing again as a society to create responses that proactively assist? Because we just continue to perpetuate that cycle of disadvantage.
Absolutely. I'm coming towards our time together, and I've sort of thought it'd be good, really timely sort of yarn, given all the stuff that we've talked about around ways of thinking, ways of working. We've talked a lot of sort of big sort of picture sort of stuff as well. We've looked at, decolonizing ways of working and thinking and stuff like that. And there's some really big things happening in the country at the moment, around the current referendum yarns around a voice to parliament and all that sort of stuff. And as a Pacifica Indigenous man, I'd really love to hear your perspectives around that sort of space in terms of the national conversation right now. I think for myself, it's one that I'm still sort of navigating with, in terms of I have like a practical head from a policy lens that's telling me like, this makes sense. And then I have a decolonizing blackfella lens that's like, fuck the system, burn it all down, let's start again, you know?
Totally.
But I think there's a lot of people out there that are wrestling with that same sort of lens that they're trying to lead with.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've come across similar sorts of, you know, or what your own perspectives might be when you're thinking about some of the national conversations that are happening right now.
Yeah.
And maybe that leads into other stuff about how we think about agreement making and decision making with, you know, Aboriginal communities or different communities. So
yeah, totally. You're right. There's multiple ways of approaching, I think, a lot of these particular topic areas, especially when it comes to traditional practices and how do we bring them into modernity, into the way in which we understand society. And I'm greatly challenged at times about being able to reach back into pre-colonial ways of knowing and doing, being, becoming, and bring them into the way in which we understand reality. And a lot of the time it is about being able to understand that they can work alongside each other, but it is a shared conversation. Everyone needs to be involved. So when we think about Indigenous matters, a lot of the time we go, okay, we'll just leave it to those people over there to deal with it. Yeah. But we then fail to understand that we're all part of that bigger conversation. So it is a matter of ensuring that everyone is across it. An example is a lot of my previous work around being able to decolonize perspectives, especially when it comes to marginalized communities, has been around understanding some of our pre-colonial practices. That includes things like the way in which we understand sexuality. So I'm doing a bit of work in that space, and I've done that space also with the National Rugby League, and I've been working with them for a while as well. And this idea of how do we ensure that such diverse views are also included in our modern way of knowing and doing and interacting with each other. And a lot of the time it is about still keeping up with people's expectations, today's expectations, but it's also going, okay, how do we have a shared conversation about these things, especially with what we did prior to colonization? Yeah,
definitely. And I think it's one that we'll continue to navigate on the journey throughout the year, but it's definitely a critical one that we need to bring to that lens and that thinking and all that sort of stuff as well. You talked about that stuff you do with the NRL, and it tweaked a memory because I shared one of your articles last year with my daughter who wrote about you actually in the lens of that conversation for a paper that she was doing for her school. And in the context of everything that came out with the Manly saga last year, I think it was your piece that you wrote around that. And even just some of that stuff you said there about how do you, bring all these views into this conversation? Because I remember when that happened, one of the big things that a lot of the players were saying was lack of consultation, no consultation was the anchor for that stance.
Yes.
And then I often think about, well, how do you navigate consultation and purpose?
And it leads to what we were just saying about how do we ensure that everyone's part of the same conversation. So I've been doing lots of different parts of my work with the NRL over the years. A lot of my counselling work is with NRL players and working with them and some of their stuff around mental health and well-being and drugs and alcohol. And part of that has been to help people understand what are their strengths, but also creating solutions. And that's really the heart of the answer I want to give is how do we create scope for everyone to be part of the conversation to create a shared solution? And one of the ways that we do that is education. How do we create scope for diverse lived experience to be part of that shared conversation? So going back to the Manly Pride jersey, one of the key things I was saying, and other people like Ian Roberts that works in this space for a while and a long time being a thought leader in this, is how do we create scope for other people's diversity to be part of that shared conversation? So it really is about enabling people that may come from a faith background, that may come from a diverse gender or sexuality expression, to also be part of a shared conversation. And really, again, it's about that humanity. If we are able to connect and create scope for people from diversity to be understood for their diversity and to be valued for their diversity, I then can connect with you because now I get to understand you better.
Definitely. And you're completely right, because if you don't have that space for everybody to be able to have a voice, then we almost lose it almost in some essence loses a level of its integrity,
That's right.
If people don't feel like they've been heard, or have feel silenced, or have
That's
had
right.
less validity in terms of their lived experience and how that contributes to the conversation.
That's right. And if we don't have the opportunity for such narratives to be part of that shared conversation, then we neglect and negate that lived experience.
Yes.
So really, it is about having multiple chairs at the same table and allowing everyone to actually have an opportunity to contribute to that conversation. And that's what really the voice, I think, in different ways, shapes and form, is striving to achieve. I know there are differing opinions and views on the voice to Parliament. I get that. In essence, it is about, though, creating a safe space for everyone to come together to have that shared conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Right, I feel like we could have a yarn for another few hours.
Totally.
It's been, I always get any opportunity for us to share space. I really get a lot out of it.
Likewise.
This whole space we're playing in and talking to is everything that we're really about here at Impact Policy. So being able to have those yarns with, leaders like yourself and to be able to connect around that sort of stuff, for me, I find it really inspiring. It really motivates, I think, what comes out of here and the work that we're trying to do as well. And I guess reaffirms in some ways that we are going in the right direction as well with our thinking. So again, thanks for giving up your time. You've come here off your own bat. We got no budget for guests here. So,
only love.
Yeah,
Love's the budget.
That's it.
Love it.
That's it. So yeah, thank you so much. And hopefully we get you on again in the future to have a yarn.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Vinaka Bakalevu, and see you next time.
Cheers. Thanks everyone. See ya.